In the summer of 1956, a small single-engine plane lifted off from a dirt airstrip in the mountains of northern Utah with a tank of water bolted into its belly. Inside that tank were thousands of baby trout, each one no longer than your finger. The plane climbed over a wall of granite peaks, leveled off maybe 100 feet above the surface of a lake that sat above the tree line, and then a hatch in the floor of the aircraft snapped open. For a few seconds, the air behind the plane turned silver. Thousands of tiny fish, caught in a gush of water, tumbled out into open sky and fluttered down toward a lake that, until that exact moment, had never held a single fish in its entire existence. Nobody on the ground was waiting to catch them. Most of those lakes sat miles from the nearest road, in country so steep and so high that the only way in was on foot or on horseback. The fish fell, the water took them, and the plane banked away toward the next lake on the list. By the end of that decade, Utah had quietly begun one of the strangest and longest-running wildlife operations in the American West. And nearly 70 years later, in 2025, it has never stopped. The state still does this. Every single summer, planes still climb over the winter mountains and rain fish out of the sky into hundreds of lakes that no truck, no road, and no person could ever reach in time. Today, more than 300 high-elevation lakes across Utah are stocked this way every year, ranging from tiny ponds smaller than 5 acres to bodies of water spreading across 500 acres. A single modern flight can carry as many as 35,000 fish and drop them into 7 different lakes before it ever needs to land and reload. In one day, one plane and one pilot can stock between 40 and 60 separate lakes scattered across a mountain range. What started in 1956 as a desperate solution to an impossible logistics problem has become a 70-year aerial operation hiding in plain sight in some of the most remote and beautiful country in the lower 48 states. And almost nobody outside of Utah knew it was happening at all. How it began, why it works, what those fish did to those silent mountain lakes, and the uncomfortable scientific truth that scientists only uncovered decades later. This is that story. This is the full story. From the post-war fishing boom that put unbearable pressure on Utah's backcountry, to a method borrowed from California and refined by a single state hatchery, to the physics that lets a 2-inch fish survive a fall from a moving airplane, to the modern research that revealed these so-called empty lakes were never empty at all. Most videos about flying fish show you the viral 30-second clip of trout pouring out of a plane, call it bizarre, and move on. This one follows the actual record. Almost 70 years deep into the survival rates, the engineering of the drop, the historical report that documented how it began, the live state database that proves it is still running this very year, and the peer-reviewed ecology that complicates the entire heroic story in ways the cheerful viral clips never mention. Every claim in this video is drawn from the official Utah Division of Wildlife Resources aerial stocking records, the historical account written by Ted Hallows, supervisor of the Camas State Fish Hatchery, and the man cited as the keeper of this program's origin story, the state's own live fish stocking database that anyone can search right now, the division's official 2021 footage of the drops, and the broader body of peer-reviewed research on what introduced fish do to high mountain lakes across the American West. This is not a quirky internet curiosity. This is what the record actually documents. But before you can understand why a state government decided the only sensible way to stock a lake was to throw fish out of an airplane, you need to understand the lakes themselves. Because these are not ordinary lakes. And the assumption that they were lifeless before the fish arrived turns out to be the single most important misunderstanding in the whole story. High in the mountains of the American West, above roughly 9,000 feet, sit thousands of small lakes that were carved out by glaciers tens of thousands of years ago. The ice gouged deep bowls out of the rock, called cirques, and when it melted, those bowls filled with some of the clearest, coldest, most pristine fresh water on the continent. The Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah alone hold more than 650 of these fishable lakes, one of the densest concentrations of high alpine water anywhere in the country. And here is the critical fact that the cheerful version of this story leaves out. Almost none of them naturally contained fish. The reason is simple geography. Fish move upstream through connected rivers and streams, but the streams flowing out of these high lakes are interrupted by waterfalls, steep boulder fields, and stretches of rapids far too violent for any fish to climb. A trout swimming up from the valley below would hit a 40-foot waterfall and stop. It could go no higher. So for thousands of years, the water above those barriers stayed exactly as the glaciers left it: cold, clear, and completely fishless. But fishless does not mean dead. This is the part that matters. Those lakes were teeming with life. They were the breeding grounds for native amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and toads that had evolved over thousands of years in water with no predators waiting to eat their eggs and tadpoles. They held vast clouds of zooplankton, tiny drifting animals at the base of the food web. The shallows crawled with aquatic insects, dragonfly larvae, mayflies, beetles, and water bugs. Birds came to feed on them. The entire system was tuned to function without a single fish in it. These were some of the last truly fish-free freshwater ecosystems left in North America, and that fish-free condition was not an accident or a failure. It was the natural state of the place, maintained by the mountains themselves for tens of thousands of years. Remember that. Because everything Utah did next was built on the assumption that an empty lake was a wasted lake. And that assumption is the quiet fault line running underneath this entire heroic story. Now, the trout. The fish that Utah drops are not adults. They are fingerlings, baby trout between 1 and 3 inches long, raised in state hatcheries until they are just big enough to survive on their own. An adult trout dropped from a plane would almost certainly die on impact, hitting the water like a stone. But a fingerling that small has almost no mass. When it falls, the air resists its tiny body so strongly that it slows down dramatically, the same reason a feather drifts and a rock plummets. The fish do not crash. In the words of the hatchery crews who have watched it happen thousands of times, they flutter. They drift down through the air alongside a spray of water that fell with them, and they hit the surface gently enough to swim away. This single biological detail, the physics of a 2-inch animal in freefall, is the entire reason this method works at all. Get the size even slightly wrong, and the whole operation turns into a slaughter. Get it right, and you can stock an unreachable lake in 3 seconds from a moving aircraft. Later in this video, you will see exactly how high those survival rates turned out to be, and how the state proved it. But first, you need to understand why anyone was desperate enough to try. When you build a fishing culture around lakes that people cannot reach, you create a problem that has only one expensive solution. And by the middle of the 20th century, Utah had built exactly that problem for itself. After the Second World War, outdoor recreation across the American West exploded. Returning veterans, growing families, new highways, and a booming post-war economy sent more people than ever into the mountains with fishing rods. Fishing became a multi-million-dollar piece of the state's economy, and anglers wanted what anglers always want: more lakes, more fish, more places to cast a line. The trouble was that the most beautiful fishing country in Utah, those hundreds of glittering alpine lakes, was almost entirely out of reach. You could not drive to them. Many of them sat 10, 12, even 15 miles from the nearest road, up trails that climbed thousands of feet through rock and timber. And because they were naturally fishless, simply hiking up to one with a rod was pointless. There was nothing in the water to catch. So if the state wanted those lakes to hold fish, the state had to carry the fish up there itself. And the way they did it before 1956 was almost unimaginably difficult. The old method was pack animals and milk cans. A hatchery worker would fill heavy metal milk cans with water and small trout fry, strap those cans to the sides of a string of pack horses or mules, and begin a journey that could take days. Because trout are cold water animals that need high levels of dissolved oxygen, the water in those cans had to be constantly refreshed and aerated, or the fish would suffocate. So the rhythm of the trip was brutal and slow. The biologist would lead his pack train to a stream, stop, and pour out the warm, stale water, then refill every can with fresh cold water from the creek. He would tie a gunny sack over the top of each can to keep the water from sloshing out. Then he would strap the cans back onto the horses and walk on, and the very motion of the animals plodding up the trail would jostle the water just enough to keep oxygen mixing into it and the fish alive. On a long trip, he would stop again and again to change the water. What an entire summer of this looked like was a small number of men and animals spending months in the backcountry to stock a fraction of the lakes that needed stocking. It was, in the words of the old hatchery records, slow, exhausting, and limited by the simple endurance of horses and men. There were more than 650 lakes in the Uinta Mountains alone. At the pace of a pack train, the math never worked. Most of those lakes would simply stay empty forever. The breakthrough did not start in Utah. It started in California, where wildlife officials had begun experimenting with using small airplanes to drop fish into their own unreachable Sierra Nevada lakes. The idea was audacious and, on its face, absurd. You would load fingerlings into a tank inside an airplane, fly low over a lake, open a hatch, and let gravity do the rest. No landing, no pack animals, no trail. Just a plane, a pilot, and a few seconds over the water. Utah watched what California was doing, and in 1956, the state adopted the method for its own mountains. The historical record of when and why this began in Utah was later set down by Ted Hallows, the supervisor of the Camas State Fish Hatchery, a facility that had been raising fish since 1928 and that would go on to coordinate the state's aerial stocking program for decades. His account is the document the state and journalists still point to as the origin story of the entire operation. The engineering problem was the fish, not the plane. The aircraft was the easy part. The hard part was building a delivery system that got tiny, fragile, cold water animals from a hatchery tank into the air at 70 to 80 miles per hour and down into a lake alive. The answer came down to three things working together. First, the size of the fish, those 1 to 3 inch fingerlings whose tiny bodies let the air slow their fall. Second, the water. The fish are not dropped dry. They fall inside a burst of water that cushions them and keeps them wet through the descent. And third, the tank itself. The system the state settled on, and still uses today, is built around a single-engine light aircraft called a Cessna 185 Skywagon, fitted with a specialized tank that holds hundreds of pounds of water and as much as 84 pounds of fish. The tank is divided into 7 separate chambers. 7 chambers means the pilot can carry fish for 7 different lakes in one load, and release each chamber over a different lake without ever landing. The fish are taken off their feed before the flight to reduce waste and stress, then weighed and counted so that exactly the right number of exactly the right species goes to exactly the right lake. There was one more thing the state needed before it could trust this method completely: proof. It is one thing to watch fish fall and assume they survived. It is another thing to know. And so, exactly as you would hope a careful agency would do, biologists went to the lakes during the drops and set nets in the water within minutes of the fish hitting the surface. They pulled those nets back up and counted what was alive. What they found is the number that made this whole strange method legitimate. Survival of the aerially stocked fingerlings was not just acceptable, it was extraordinary. More than 95% of the fish survived the fall. The state had taken one of the most violent-sounding ideas in wildlife management, dropping live animals out of an airplane, and proven with nets and numbers that almost all of them lived. The flutter was real, the physics held, and with that, the operation went from experiment to standard practice. The scale it reached is genuinely hard to picture. A single Cessna, flying just 50 to 150 feet above the water, barely clearing the trees and skimming under the cliffs, threading between mountain walls that determine how low the pilot dares to go, can drop as many as 35,000 fish in one flight, hit 7 lakes on that single load, and stock 40 to 60 lakes in a single day of flying. Across an entire summer, Utah aerially stocks more than 300 high mountain lakes, with some sources putting the number as high as 450. The most popular lakes get stocked every single year. The more remote, less fished waters are stocked on a 3 to 5 year rotation, and to save fuel and time, the crews stock every lake in one mountain drainage in a single pass before moving to the next. The species raining down change with the season and the lake. Brook trout, rainbow trout, tiger trout, and a hybrid called splake go in through the summer. Cutthroat trout, the only trout actually native to Utah, and Arctic grayling go in through the fall. And the fish themselves are so small and the drop so gentle that people who have stood on the shore during a stocking flight say the sound of thousands of fingerlings hitting the lake is not a crash or a splash at all. It sounds, they say, like a sudden burst of rain falling on the water. For decades, almost nobody outside of Utah's hatcheries and a handful of devoted anglers had any idea this was happening. The program ran quietly through the backcountry, summer after summer, an enormous logistical machine operating where almost no one could see it. And then, around 2013 and 2014, that changed completely. Ted Hallows, the same hatchery supervisor whose report documented the program's history, mounted a small GoPro camera to the belly of the stocking plane and filmed what the drop actually looked like from beneath the aircraft. The footage showed a clear mountain lake sliding by below, the hatch opening, and a stream of silver fingerlings and water pouring out into open air and scattering down toward the surface. The video was unlike anything most people had ever seen. It spread across the internet and was viewed by millions of people who had no idea that fish were being parachuted, more or less, into the wilderness. The Division of Wildlife Resources released its own polished footage in 2021, narrated by agency staff, confirming that the practice had been going on since the 1950s, and that survival, in their words, was incredibly high. A program that had spent more than half a century in obscurity became, almost overnight, one of the most famous wildlife operations in the country. The clips were called a dream job. The whole thing looked like a triumph, and in a great many ways, it genuinely was. But the viral clips only ever showed you the falling fish. They never showed you the lake before the plane arrived, and they never followed what happened in the years after. And that is where this story stops being simple. Because in the decades after Utah and California and half the mountain states had been filling their high lakes with trout, scientists finally began to study what those fish were actually doing to the water they landed in. And what they found was not the heroic restoration story everyone assumed. The first surprise was the sheer scale of the transformation, and it really was a transformation. Within a few years of stocking, a lake that had never held a fish in 10,000 years could hold a thriving, self-sustaining trout population. Those fish grew fat on the abundant insects and zooplankton that had never faced a predator before. A barren-seeming bowl of water became a destination. Anglers hiked 10 and 15 miles to reach lakes that, without the airplane, would have stayed empty forever. An entire statewide recreational fishery, worth a great deal of money and woven deep into Utah's outdoor culture, was quite literally built out of the sky. Measured purely by the goal it was designed for, putting catchable fish into unreachable water, the program was a staggering success that has now run without interruption for almost 70 years. The second surprise was the cost of that success, and it is the part the cheerful clips never mention. Those lakes were never empty. They were fishless, and fishless was the point of them. When trout arrive in a lake that evolved with no fish, they eat exactly the things that had never been eaten before. They are visual hunters, and they target the larger, more visible animals first. Across the American West, peer-reviewed research has documented again and again what follows. Native amphibians decline. Large zooplankton vanish. Sensitive aquatic insects disappear from the shallows. In the Sierra Nevada of California, the once abundant mountain yellow-legged frog collapsed across huge portions of its range, and introduced trout were identified as a leading cause, eating the tadpoles that had no defenses against a predator their species had never encountered. And in one of the most striking findings of all, researchers studying high lakes in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in neighboring Idaho, the very same protected wilderness where the famous parachuting beavers were dropped in 1948, documented that introduced trout were associated with fewer native frogs and salamanders, not just in the stocked lakes themselves, but across entire mountain basins. The same airplane logic that filled the West with fish had quietly been removing the frogs, the salamanders, and the invertebrates that those lakes had sheltered since the last ice age. The lakes did not come alive when the fish arrived, they traded one kind of life for another. The third surprise is the most hopeful one, and it is where the modern story is heading, because the science did not stay buried. As the ecological research accumulated, wildlife agencies, including Utah's, began changing how they stock. The state now treats its native cutthroat trout differently from everything else, stocking it carefully into waters where it belongs. And critically, the majority of the other trout that Utah drops from the air today are sterile. They are triploid fish, bred so that they cannot reproduce, which means the state can offer anglers a catch without creating a permanent, self-spreading population that overruns a basin and erases its native life. The division deliberately avoids stocking species into waters where they could harm native fish. Some lakes that were stocked for generations have been allowed to go quiet again. In parts of the West, fish have even been removed from chosen lakes, specifically to let the frogs and the insects and the silence return. The program that began in 1956 with the simple goal of filling empty water has slowly become something more careful and more aware, a balancing act between the people who want to fish a mountain lake and the fragile, ancient ecosystem that was thriving there long before the first plane ever flew over. What this means is that the famous viral clip of fish falling from a Utah sky is true, but it is only the first frame of a much longer and much more complicated picture. The 1956 decision to stock from the air solved a real problem with genuine brilliance. The physics of the fluttering fingerling is real. The 95% survival is real. The 70-year run is real, and it is still running this year, with a live state database that lets anyone search, lake by lake, every fish that falls from a Utah plain. But the deeper truth, the one that took scientists decades to assemble, is that those mountain lakes were never the dead, empty bowls the story imagined them to be. They were quiet, complete, ancient worlds. And the airplane changed them forever. The men who started this in 1956 were not villains, and they were not fools. They were trying to give people more places to fish in a state that loved fishing, and they invented one of the most ingenious wildlife delivery methods ever devised to do it. What they could not have known, what almost nobody knew until the research caught up, was that the lakes they were filling had a hidden life of their own, and that the cost of the fish would be measured in frogs and insects and the loss of some of the last fishless water on the continent. The modern program, with its sterile fish and its protected native trout and its growing scientific caution, is the state slowly learning that lesson in real time. So here is the whole strange truth in one breath. A single Cessna with 7 chambers in its belly. Fingerlings barely 2 inches long, fluttering down through mountain air at 80 miles per hour. As many as 35,000 fish in a single flight, 40 to 60 lakes in a single day, more than 300 lakes every single summer for nearly 70 years, falling into water so remote that no road, no truck, and no helicopter in the thin alpine air could ever reach it. A method borrowed from California, documented by a hatchery supervisor named Ted Hallows, proven with nets in the minutes after the drop, hidden in plain sight for half a century, and then revealed to millions through a camera bolted to the bottom of a plane. And underneath all of it, hundreds of ancient, glittering glacial lakes that were never dead at all, quietly trading the life they had always known for the trout that came falling out of the sky. But Utah is not the only place where humans reached for an aircraft to reshape a landscape they could not otherwise touch. In our next video, we travel north, to the moment a government decided that the only way to save an entire population of animals from a flood was to capture them, crate them, and move them by air into country no truck could enter. What happened to those animals, and to the land they were dropped into, turned an act of desperation into one of the most surprising rescue stories on the continent. If you thought raining fish out of an airplane was strange, wait until you see what it takes to move an entire herd by air. You will never look at a wildlife rescue the same way again.